My name's Tom Standage. I'm the digital editor at The Economist magazine, and I'm also the author of several history books. And my most recent book is called Writing on the Wall, Social Media, the First 2,000 Years. And it provides a sort of long view of social media going back to the Roman period. Well, the idea of the book is to say that social media is much older than everyone thinks it is. We think of it as something that only arose in the last sort of 15 years of the internet era. But in fact, if you look at the way information traveled in history, it involved people passing stuff to each other along social networks and sharing it and recommending it and copying it. And as far as I'm concerned, that's social media. So just because it doesn't involve the internet doesn't mean it doesn't count as social media. So I looked at historical examples of this kind of style of distributing information. The earliest I could find is from the late Roman Republic, the 1st century BC, but there are other examples: the pamphlets of Martin Luther, English Civil War pamphlets, poetry in the Tudor court, pamphlets in the run-up to the American Revolution and local newspapers as well, and poetry that was circulated before the French Revolution. And these are all actually examples of social media ecosystems. And the interesting thing about them is that they are very similar in the sort of reactions that they inspired and the dynamics associated with them to modern social media systems, which means that we can answer many of the questions we have about social media today by looking at these historical precursors. I focused on the West in this book because although I found a few examples from Asia, it was very clear to me that I couldn't see into the sources. You know, I don't read Chinese. I spoke to my godfather, who's actually a professor of Chinese history, and he helped me with a few examples. But I feared that I would do a good job of mining the Western sources and a really bad job of doing the Asian sources. So in the introduction of the book, I say this is a new way of looking at the history of Western media. So that's mainly the reason that there are some really nice examples of social poetry in the Japanese court, for example. But I really felt that I was only seeing the tip of the iceberg, and that it wasn't really, it wasn't going to be fair, a fair representation of what was really going on there. So I limited the scope to the West for that reason. The invention of writing is obviously from the Middle East, so that's Mesopotamia and Egypt. It arises in both of those places. So I mean, there's an awful lot of cross-cultural influences going on here, and the idea of the West is a relatively, it's a relatively recent one. I mean, we kind of inherit it from the Greeks, and the idea that everything to the east of the Bosphorus is the East, and is the Persians, and is evil. So I'm not really that obsessed with sort of trying to argue that the West is that better than anywhere else. That's not really where I'm coming from. It's the culture I understand, and it's also the culture that has exported its media technologies to a lot of other places. So yes, we have paper from and movable type from China, but things like computer science and the internet and newspapers are all inventions, fairly recent inventions of Western civilizations, of European civilizations and their offshoots. So that's very fertile ground for the kind of thing I'm interested in. And those are also the technologies that are now very influential all over the world today. So everyone's using the same internet that's running on the TCP/IP protocol invented by 2 Americans. So the upshot is that we're using Chinese and Korean phones on a network invented by Americans. So this is a great sort of example of globalization. Well, graffiti isn't really social media. I mean, I included it in the Roman chapter just because it was so cute, and because what you get in the Roman period is this much greater literacy than has been in previous eras, and you get, much as people today are very proud of their computer literacy and they're very excited by the fact that everyone can publish. The same sort of thing happened in the Roman period. People could write and read, and a much wider swathe of society could read and write, and so they really sort of enjoyed taking advantage of that, and graffiti was one of the ways that they did it. So that's really, for me, the analogy. It's the way they're sort of reveling in their literacy, and so it doesn't, you know, they're not actually copying and sharing and recommending. I mean, there's a little bit of that. There are sort of TripAdvisor reviews written on walls in Pompeii, and there are some dialogues and there are some comment threads, but modern graffiti, I don't think is you know, is a different thing. I mean, that's more like a sort of art form, and so I didn't really want to relate it to that. I could have done, yes. I think the real question is whether you want to sort of break the chronology of when you're talking about the 17th century. I mean, the structure of this book is it's a world history, and in the prehistory chapters, obviously, I have to refer to the work of anthropologists like Robin Dunbar. But elsewhere, I really try and avoid roping in modern characters as authorities when I'm talking about historical periods. I really want to just stay in the historical period and talk about that period. So that's why I bring up Habermas sort of later on in the I think it's in the period where sort of closer to his own time. And this, you know, the idea of the construction of the public sphere and so on. And I kind of agree with him. I kind of don't. I mean, it's, you know, actually, a lot of the scholarship that he based his work on suggested that the public sphere emerges in England right at the end of the 17th century, and I would argue that it was earlier, and that the coffee houses were just as effective a public sphere. So he's looking at the breakdown of the censorship on newspapers that happens in the 1690s. So I basically agree with his thesis, but not with the detail of the scholarship that he bases it on, because a lot of it was actually quite old, and I think has been superseded, and he's since moved on to other things himself. I wasn't that interested in highlighting power structures, actually. I mean, other books of mine have looked more closely at this. So the way that food structures society and the way that food has been used to sort of reinforce power structures. In this case, I was really interested just in the kind of, you know, the simple network structure, the peer-to-peer structure, and the various incarnations of that. And yes, that does mean it comes into contact with, you know, it's used by activist movements, and it comes into contact with you know, authoritarian powers and so on. But that wasn't really a primary concern of mine, I have to say. Firstly, I'm more inclined to say that social media makes us more rather than less social. So, you know, when everyone's on the train and they're on their smartphones, they're talking to their friends, and it's not the case that in the old days everyone talked to everyone else in the train carriage. They didn't. They read books and read newspapers. So, you know, I don't think it's making people less social. And I think actually Zeynep's point that social media is actually a very good antidote to many of the difficulties people have in modern life, where you've got lots of migration, you've got lots of you know, families with two parents working, and so actually using social media to bind families together can be very useful. So I have a lot of sympathy with that view. On the privacy side of things, I think it's interesting. We're seeing a shift there. I mean, I follow the rule that I wouldn't post anything on social media that I wouldn't want to see on the front page of the New York Times. So I don't use sort of private messaging or private chat rooms or anything like that. My wife has lots of private chat rooms that she, you know, talks photography about with her friends, and she likes that sort of thing. And so occasionally, when Facebook changes its rules, that could be a bit embarrassing. But basically, I follow the rule of not really trying to keep anything secret on social media. What I think is very interesting is the way that the argument has shifted in the last couple of years. So with the rise of things like Snapchat, that being able to forget things is becoming a feature. So for a long time, people were saying, oh, well, the thing about teenagers these days is they'll share everything online and they'll regret it when they're older because their employers will look them up and see embarrassing things that they did. And that doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, they are sharing lots of stuff online, but there has been this gravitation towards temporary, forgettable forms of media, and I think that's entirely understandable. So I think it's a matter of choosing the right platform for the right thing that you want to do. And if it's disposable conversations with your friends, that's fine. If it's talking with your peers in public on Twitter, then that's a slightly different thing. So I don't have a kind of prescriptive view. I think it's about choosing the right horses for the right courses. I think it's a very good open question as to whether these not-for-profit open social platforms will go anywhere. Wikipedia sort of is one, I suppose, but it's really the sort of messaging and person-to-person platforms that I'm interested in. So if you look at the origins of social media on the internet, I think the first examples were things like bulletin boards and Usenet in particular. And Usenet is a distributed social discussion platform. The problem is it's quite slow and quite inefficient. And it turns out that in order to make social sharing work quickly and efficiently, in order to guarantee timely in-order delivery of status updates in the way that Facebook and Twitter do, then you really do need a centralized platform. And that said, I think that there will be ways of people will find ways to decentralize it. So I'm very interested in things like tent.io and Diaspora and these other attempts to make distributed social platforms, just because if you look at the way email and web publishing work, they are open distributed systems, and it seems a bit odd that we are relying on closed proprietary corporate systems for our social media. We're treating them as a public sphere, but they're not really. They're like a giant mall rather than a market square. And so I wonder if that will come to be seen as an anomaly. It may be that competition between these private platforms will keep them honest, but I can imagine a scenario where a open source social platform becomes popular, then there's a sort of catastrophic privacy breach on one of the other big platforms, and people consider moving over. So that's something I'm really interested to see over the next 10 years, how that develops, because it does seem anomalous to me that social media isn't as open and standards based as web publishing and email already are. Well, I'd like to, at some point, I would like to figure out, I would like to put in some content from Asia, but I would just need to be more confident that I wasn't, choosing random examples and that I had actually got my head around the subject matter. So that's I think would be quite difficult. The other thing I'd like to do actually is I'd like to add, at the moment I'd like to add a chapter before the internet chapter on analog social media before the internet. And this would look at things like mixtapes and samizdat using photocopiers in the Soviet Union, and the distribution of sermons in pre-revolutionary Iran on cassette tape. And these are all, and zines as well, I mean, fanzines. These are all really nice examples of social media that are modern and recognizable, or at least reasonably modern, but they don't rely on digital networks. And I think, those are a nice reminder of the fact that in living memory, people have used forms of social media that didn't rely on the internet. And I think, in retrospect, that's something I'd like to have included. So if I had masses of time, which I don't have, to go and revise the book, that's what I'd add.